Thanks, Jacob. It's Jacob, isn't it? Yeah. Jacob and Zach. And good evening, everyone. So you notice what Jesus said there in verse 32 of John chapter 8, which we might come back to a little bit later. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. So tonight we're going to look at this specific aspect of the spiritual warrior, which is loins girt with truth. So I know this was covered by Nathan on the first night, but why does Paul use this image of a soldier or a warrior here in Ephesians chapter 6? Is he sort of encouraging us to go out and do battle and attack other people? That sort of might be what we get from the image of a soldier or a warrior. Well, that's not really the answer, is it? The answer is that we're equipping our spiritual selves to fight against our natural selves. So you'll notice that quote from Ephesians chapter 6, which, this is the beginning of this description of the armour of God, this spiritual warrior that we like to call it. In Ephesians 6, verse 11 to 12, it says, "Put on the whole armour of God, that you might be able to withstand against the wiles of the devil." So that's what we're standing against, isn't it? The wiles of the devil. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood." So it's not against people, it's not against other people per se. We're not here to fight people. But we are standing against the wiles of the devil. So other translations have the schemes of the devil. So that we're talking about, we understand the devil is human nature, our own natural proneness towards sin. So the schemes of the devil is you as well, isn't it? It's what's inside you, scheming to do the wrong thing all the time. I know you're all like that. But against principalities and against powers and against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Not physical, it's spiritual. So I think what he's describing there is the dominant human philosophies, the powers of darkness in this world. It's the power that takes over this world, isn't it? Whatever humanist philosophy is dominant at the time. In Paul's day it was mostly Greek philosophy and perhaps paganism. Today it's very much humanism. But that's what we're finding. It's that those philosophies that might appeal to us or challenge our faith, that's what we're fighting. So the battle is within, essentially. So, for example, the sword, how do we use a sword? On whom do we use a sword? Well, the writer of Hebrews tells us about that, doesn't he? He says, assuming it's a he, "For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to dividing asunder of soul and spirit." It's inside you again, isn't it? That's where we use the sword of the Spirit, and of the joints and the marrows, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. So the thoughts and the intents of the heart. Whose heart are we supposed to be using on? Is it other people's hearts that we use the word of God on? No, it's our own hearts. It's supposed to discern between what's right and wrong in our own hearts and where our own hearts can deceive us. So when we think about this idea of waging warfare, we might think about different types of religious warriors down through the centuries. We've got the zealots get mentioned in the New Testament. We've got ISIS there, obviously extreme version of Islam, and we've got the Southern Baptists just for an extreme version of Christianity. And sometimes I think we might think that perhaps the more extreme someone is, the more faith or the more conviction they have, and that's a pretty natural human judgment to reach. I'm sure some Muslims have that view of ISIS. And perhaps sometimes we think, well, perhaps we should be doing more like the Southern Baptists in the USA and yelling at people on street corners and such like. The zealots of the first century, so I don't know if you know who they were, but they were resistant to Roman rule in the first century. Jewish resistors to the Roman occupation of their land. So we've got an example of Simon Zelotes in Luke chapter 6 verse 15, and the suggestion is of course that he was a zealot before he became a follower of Christ, and they used to sneak around with daggers under their cloaks and stab the odd Roman when they met them in the street. So again, a zeal for what they thought was God at the time, but is that what God is after when he's talking about spiritual warriors? So when we talk about being spiritual warriors, I think sometimes we think that we need to be on the offence against other people, that somehow, God's truth, the gospel, needs us to defend it, that God needs us to attack other people, anyone who disagrees with us. And that was, very much the case when I was sort of growing up amongst us as Christadelphians. It all seemed to be about winning the argument and not necessarily winning the person. But of course, the common connection between the groups that we've got up on the screen is that they sort of aim their hate at other people, whereas Christ is pretty clear that we need to be aiming love at other people. So Paul is pretty clear, I think, there in Ephesians chapter 6. Our warfare isn't against other people. It's, primarily within ourselves and against human-based philosophies and thinking. So, are we supposed to be, Bible bashers attacking others with our superior knowledge of God's word? Is that what Paul recommends the sword of the Spirit for? No, again, in Hebrews 4, it's primarily to be used upon ourselves, dividing us under between the thoughts and intents of the heart. So come over to Ephesians, because obviously that's the focus of your year at Northern Youth Group. So Ephesians, and that spiritual warrior is described for us in Ephesians chapter 6, but come back to Ephesians chapter 4, and this is how our relationships with other people should be. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14 and 15. 13, he starts talking about growing up in towards the Son of God as our head. So he's got this image of a body and us growing up into the head, which is Christ, unto a perfect man in the middle of verse 13 there, into the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that henceforth we be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine. So we know what our doctrines are, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. By the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. So there are people out there who want to convince you that you're going down the wrong path and that their path is the correct path. What's Paul's response to that? Verse 15, speaking the truth, definitely speaking the truth, no doubt about that, and we're going to learn a little bit about truth tonight. Speaking the truth in love, may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. So we've got those balancing principles there. We speak the truth, yes, but we speak it in love, not full of the hate that many of these apparently zealous religious groups do. So this whole idea about the spiritual warrior, we're equipping our spiritual selves to fight against our natural selves. So we're going to have a few group activities tonight. I think there's 3 of them. So have a look to the person on your left and on your right. They're probably your friends, not you people on the end of the row, because you don't have any friends. So the people on the left and the right, so groups of 3, and then the row in front of you perhaps. So I don't know, they're probably not your friends. They're probably, I'm not sure what the sort of the gang situation in Northern Youth Group is. But think about the people in front, so maybe go in groups of 6, 3 that are side and 3 in front of you, or 3 behind you, depending on how it works out. Stephen's going to hand out, if you haven't got any paper, because you're going to need to be looking up some quotes and just jotting down some ideas. We're not going to spend long on this because we're not. But if you haven't got any paper or a writing implement, Brother Secretary here is going to, and his able assistant Samuel, are going to hand out paper if you don't have any. But what I want you to do is look up a few quotes in your groups of about 6. Again, I don't want, getting up and walking around the room or anything like that. This is not going to take very long. But so if you don't have any paper, just put your hand up or yell loudly at Samuel. Okay. So when Samuel has, in his laconic fashion, retained his seat, then so what I want you to, so you know where the spiritual warrior is described in Ephesians 6, everyone au fait with that after 2 classes already? So what I want you to do is, with your vast and deep knowledge of what Paul describes in Ephesians 6 with the spiritual warrior, is to look at the following verses, and obviously you don't all have to look at the same verses. I suggest one of you looks at each verse. And just work out what's similar between the armour, the clothing of the spiritual warrior, and what the priest wore under the law of Moses. That's it. Go. Do it. Anyone not clear on what you need to do? It's pretty simple. Not going to take you very long, probably. Done. No questions. What? Thank you. Okay, it's Malachi 2 verse 7. Malachi 2 verse 7, don't look at verse 8. It's irrelevant. I should be able to change this. Okay, how are we going? Everyone done? Yes? No? Maybe? I think we're going to have to leave it there anyway. So, I might just get you to yell them out, the answers. Otherwise I'll pick on people individually and you won't like that. So, Exodus 28 verse 15, what do we think? What's the common denominator there? This is the simplest one.
Breastplate.
Breastplate, excellent work, Sam. So we've got them both wearing a breastplate. What about 28 verse 32? That was the next one. Anyone pick up on this one? This was a little bit slightly more obscure. What? The what? Yes, yeah. So I think it's the word 32 is the habergeon or the coat of mail. It's the same sort of word. We got it. Someone got it down here. Well done, person. So yes. Sorry. Scott's child. Yes. Yes. Okay. So yes, we've got the same idea. We've got that coat of mail idea with the priests, which is an odd thing to describe a priest's clothing at, I would have thought. What about verse 36 and 38? Helmet, yep. So we've got a head covering, a helmet of salvation. And you'll notice the words in verse 38 of Exodus 28 particularly. Accepted before the Lord, accepted before Yahweh. That's very much words of salvation, isn't it? That is salvation, to be accepted before Yahweh. So we've got a helmet of salvation. What about the trick one? Malachi 2 verse 7. Yes, maybe. In other words, no, that's not what I was thinking.
Sword of the Spirit.
Sword of the Spirit, yeah, I was thinking sword of the Spirit. So the priest's lips. So the man of the one in Revelation chapter 1, which you'll all be familiar with, where is his sword? In his mouth. So he's got the sword of the Spirit coming out of his mouth, hasn't he? So this idea of the word of God coming out of the priest's mouth is, I think, what he's talking about there with the sword of the word and the priest's lips keeping knowledge in Malachi 2. What about 28 verse 35? What do we think of this one? This is just a stab in the dark for me, to be honest, but what do you think the bells sounding would be similar, analogous to?
It's very clunky.
Clunky, okay, yep, and therefore makes a sound, which we would perhaps think is, how does this relate to the spiritual warrior, I guess, is what makes a sound that goes out throughout the whole world?
The gospel of peace.
Gospel of peace, that's what I thought. You know, you could be right, could be wrong. But yes, those bells, the sounding of the bells, that sort of message going out, you know, you can hear the priest before he gets to you because he's got these bells around the hem of his garment. So I thought that might be similar to the gospel message with which the warrior's feet are shod. So I guess the lesson here is that there are obviously different roles, different garments, but pretty similar symbology between some of the garments of the priest and this spiritual warrior. And a similar work to be done, to be honest. So you've got a spiritual labour represented by what they wear. And that labour is, you know, edifying, building up other people and replacing sin with righteousness in their own lives and hopefully in other people's lives as well. Okay, so the section that we're looking at in Ephesians 6 verse 14 talks about having loins girt. So this sort of, well, that's in the King James Version at least. And this idea of having the loins girt is sort of fairly old-fashioned language, not something we use much these days. So what does it mean? Well, there's a couple of ideas. There's girding the loins and there is being girt by something. So girding the loins, I've got that depiction from the Art of Manliness. When you hear about or read about in the Bible people girding their loins, it means sort of to gather up their garments ready for action, sort of, you know, converting a skirt, if you like, into shorts, as it were, of a type. So the point is that they're ready for action, isn't it? And the idea of girt really just means to be surrounded by, or in this case, wearing something. So in Ephesians 6 specifically, in verse 14, we're wearing truth around our loins, aren't you? Around your midriff, around your waist, like a soldier's tunic, I guess. Secured perhaps by a belt and protected, if Paul's referring to a Roman soldier here, protected by the bautia, which is those straps of leather that protect the soldier's groin, those sort of dangly straps they have in Asterix and Obelix books. That'll be the Latin of book. So yes, that's the idea of what's around a soldier's loins. And in this case, we're being girt, we're being dressed by, we are wearing truth, which we're going to look at in a minute. But now we've got another group activity. This is going to take up half the evening. We're going to make this one shorter, even though there's more quotes to look at. So look up the following quotes and just look at who is being girt in them, and what is the why are they being girt? What is the purpose of being girt in these quotes? So a couple back in Exodus, a few New Testament ones this time. Get into it. All done. Okay, are we all done? All good? Okay, so what do we got for Exodus 12, verse 11? Yep. Shotted, yep. Yep, so shoes on feet, and what else are they supposed to be doing in that verse? Had to be, yep, eating in haste and carrying a staff. So you might think of the Passover as this nice, relaxing roast lamb sort of meal, but they've got their loins girded, their shoes on their feet, they've got a staff in one hand, so they've got to eat with another hand. and they've got to eat it in haste. It's not some relaxing, family meal that they're enjoying there. So what are they ready for? Why did they have to have all this stuff on? And yeah, why? Why is this the case?
Because they needed to move quickly.
They needed to move. Yep. So they were ready to go, weren't they, kids? So they're ready to travel away from Egypt towards the promised land. Yep, exactly right. So they're ready. They've got to be ready to travel away from Egypt, the land of sin and death, and towards the promised land, the kingdom, basically. Okay, so they've got to be prepared to do that. So again, not a relaxing meal. They've got to be ready for action. What about Exodus 28, verse 42? So this is particularly mention of loins rather than being girt, but who's dressed here?
Priests.
Okay, so the priests are dressed in linen, yep, linen we think represents righteousness, which we get from Revelation, yep. So the priests probably wore these linen sort of underwear, linen boxer short type arrangement. And what's the purpose of that? Why did they have to do that? What are they ready to do? Work. They're ready to serve in the tabernacle or the temple later on. So they're ready to work, help everyone come closer to God, aren't they? That was their role. What about Proverbs 31 verse 17? Yep, what does she do? She's a woman of action. It's what we like in women, isn't it? So ready to work. Again, so all of these things are all about, movement. It's not about sitting back and relaxing. It's about being ready for action. John 13 verse 4, who gets girt here?
Christ washing his hands.
Okay, and what does he get girt with?
Garments. No, he takes them off.
Yeah, takes garments off and whacks on a towel. Okay, so he is ready for washing. And what does that represent? What does he say later on in that chapter? Doesn't have to be you, Josh. Anyone can answer this one. I've washed your feet, so do to others. You should wash each other's feet. So he's there. So that feet washing thing is a couple of things, really, isn't it? It's both cleansing, which we can only get from Christ, but it's also service, isn't it? Serving other people, washing their feet. So again, that's what we get together for. That's what Sunday mornings are for. That's what youth groups are for. Not just serving of food, obviously, but putting aside our own needs, putting aside our own garments, getting dressed in a towel and helping out with other people, putting aside our own needs, helping, talking those in need, not just your mates afterwards, but people that really need to talk with someone else. So what are we up to? John 21 verse 7. Who gets girt here? Peter gets girt in fisherman's coat because he's going to meet Christ. He's going to swim towards Christ. Again, this idea of action. So in John chapter 13, it's action. It's about serving other people. In John 21, it's about getting closer to Christ, in this case, via a swim in the Sea of Galilee. What about Luke 12, 35 and 36? Yep. Us, exactly right. And we've got to be what? Yeah. So again, ready to move at a moment's notice. It's sort of a bit like Exodus and Passover language, isn't it? We don't know when the master's going to knock. We don't know when that angel's going to pass over the house. But we've got to be ready at a moment's notice, ready to open the door to him. So again, us always ready to receive Christ, living now as though he is, returning or has returned even. So your common theme there, which you probably can already see, is this idea of being ready for work, ready for action, ready for service. It's not a thing that's done in a sort of relaxed way. We've got to be active disciples of Christ's. Okay, so that's the idea of getting girt, or being girt, or being girt by truth. So now we want to look at the second aspect of this symbol, which is the idea of truth itself. So I think truth is used in a couple of ways in the Bible, and we're going to look at both of them individually. So we've got the question up there, what is truth? And we're quoting who there? Who asked what is truth?
Felix?
No, close though.
Festus?
Festus. Pilate, yes, whoever said Pilate is correct. So Pilate said that of Jesus Christ at his trial. What is truth? So we want to look at how it's used, and I think it's used at least a couple of ways in the Bible. So we've got the idea, we all think that we are in the truth, or going to be in the truth, hopefully. Get baptised. We get baptised. We call our system of beliefs the truth. And we could define that as a group of defined teachings, doctrines, morals perhaps, a definition of what is right and also what is wrong, what is true and what is false. So this idea of truth as defined teachings, everyone's sort of comfortable with that idea, that is truth. And we've also got the idea in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, of the idea of living truthfully, or living truly. In other words, living your life as a reflection of the truth that you believe. And we're going to look at examples of people that didn't do that in a minute. But does that also make sort of sense? We profess to be Christians, we profess to be followers of Christ. Do we actually live truly according to what we profess, I guess, is this other idea of truth that's used throughout the Bible. So let's look at this idea of truth as defined to start with. So a lot of today's humanistic philosophy has this idea of relative truth, which you may or may not have heard of. I'm sure you'll hear of it if you wind up in university at some stage or have been there. So we've got this idea of your truth. So the idea that your truth might be perhaps different to my truth. The way you perceive things is different to how I perceive it, but both viewpoints are equally valid. So truth becomes relative in that case, doesn't it? So you can believe what you want, I'll believe what I want about, even if that event happened right before our very eyes. So this idea of perceived truth, truth is really what you perceive it to be. And this is the idea of relativism, which I've got a definition up there. So that the view that truth and falsity, right and wrong, standards of reasoning and procedures of justification are products of different conventions and frameworks. So the idea, when it comes to truth, that it is whatever you perceive it to be. That's this idea of relativism, or perceived truth. There's no absolute right or wrong. For example, they might say, these teachings of Paul in the New Testament about ecclesial functions, for example, are really just culturally based. They're sort of affected by his context and his culture. They're not absolute truths. We don't need to worry about them today. So this is definitely one of the sort of the powers of the darkness of our age that we're told to fight against in Ephesians chapter 6. The idea that everyone's entitled to their own opinion and everyone's opinion is equally valid, especially in a moral sense. So, if you're not hurting anyone else, go for it. You can do whatever you like. There's no sort of moral boundaries on anyone in that sense. And of course, it's quite appealing because, you don't have any restrictions. And the idea of toleration is fine in itself as well. But it's certainly not for us personally, isn't it? We know what is right and wrong from God's perspective, particularly on a moral sense, also on a doctrinal sense, as we'll see shortly. He's written us, a couple of thousand pages in our Bibles about what is right and what is wrong. So we really need to use these, few thousand pages here Actually, it's probably not a few thousand, might be just under 1,000, depending on what edition you've got. Use that to determine right from wrong, true from false. That is really what girding our loins with truth is about when we talk about absolute truth as found in the pages of God's Word. Is there absolute truth to be found in the Bible? Well, certainly what the Bible tells us. Ephesians chapter 4, there's one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. Galatians chapter 1, and you could read most of Galatians and say Paul's basically saying there is a right gospel and there is a wrong gospel. So your wrong gospel might not be too many degrees removed from the right gospel, but it becomes completely ineffective. So there's definitely gospel truth to be found in the Bible, as Paul's writings show there in Ephesians and Galatians. Now, that's of course not to say that there are areas that are not fundamental that we can disagree on, but there are a bunch of teachings that we agree are fundamental, and we try to define them to the best of our human ability in our statement of faith, for example. So truth is defined in the Bible. What is absolute truth is to be found in the Bible. And Bible teaching on that is pretty clear. So if we're talking about truth as a series of teachings, moral and doctrinal, that we need to understand, how do we, as young people, ensure that our loins are girt with it, as it were? And honestly, the answer is, it's pretty boring. Not the result is boring, but the answer, you've heard this answer 1,000 times. It's to read and meditate on the Bible. There's nothing magical or new to be learnt here. You know the answer. You know the quote that I'm going to give you the answer from 2 Timothy chapter 3. So if the Bible is our only source of absolute truth, then we need to be very familiar with it. So the answer is to read and meditate on the Bible. Have questions, that's fine. There's no drama with that. But investigate to find out the answers from the Bible. Now, it's a very, as I said, simple answer, and one you've heard many, many times before, but it does take some dedication, some self-discipline to make that happen, particularly the meditating bit of it. You can read through the Bible, or just a section of the Bible fairly quickly, but then to have that running over your mind or through your mind during the day is where the real value comes from. So reading and meditating on the Bible is the key to finding out what the absolute truth of the Bible is. What about this idea of living truly? So, sort of this idea of, you've heard the phrase being true to yourself, which does have some value. It's one of those sort of new agey type slogans, but here it is sort of value. If being true to yourself is believing on the absolute truth of the Bible. So once we've worked out that sort of idea of basic truth, good versus evil, right and wrong, true and false, as revealed in the Bible, not our own philosophisings. I'm not sort of saying you go down that path. We then have to live according to that truth. And I think that's the other way that the Bible uses this idea of truth as well. So really the contrast is another term that's used throughout the Bible, is this idea of being hypocrites. So this is sort of the opposite of living truly, living truth in our own lives. The alternative is that we are hypocrites. Now the Greek word literally means a play actor, so someone who acts on the stage in a play. So they're playing a role while disguising themselves, their true selves, as a character, whoever they're playing within the play. So that's the idea of a hypocrite, a play actor, someone who's not acting out their real selves, they're acting out someone who their script has been written for. And we've got a couple of, Matthew 23 is a whole chapter on Christ's condemnation of the scribes and the Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites, people who pretend to be one thing but are actually another, right through that chapter. A couple of quotes there from verse 15. Notice the word pretense there. They devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayer. They're not really praying, they're just pretending to pray. So something to think about during ecclesial prayers, for example. They're not really communicating with God, they're pretending to be holy, Meanwhile, forcing poor old Sister Smith out of her home to build a 10-storey block of apartments on it. In verse 25, Jesus says to them, "Why aren't you scribes and Pharisees hypocrites, because you make clean the outside?" The outside looks great. The outside of the cup and the plate looks great. They've cleaned it off. But within, they're full of extortion and excess. And this really defines this idea of a hypocrite, doesn't it? Looks great on the outside, wear a white shirt and a suit and a tie to the meeting, attend every Sunday, but that bore no relation to what was going on inside. Instead, they're sitting in the meeting, dreaming about how they're going to make their next dollar, in the case of the scribes and the Pharisees probably. Or lusting after their neighbour's wife perhaps. Clean on the outside, but filthy on the inside. So Jesus has a sort of a symbol for this, I think, this idea of living truly, living truth, when he talks about the single eye. So we might just turn there. So Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, this idea of living truly according to your beliefs. And he has this to say in Matthew chapter 6. Now it's an interesting symbol to look at in the Sermon on the Mount. Here, but he says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth." So obviously we've got the idea of earthly, physical treasures that we can sort of pile up for ourselves, mostly in the form of cash these days, I guess, "where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal." So don't do that. "But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Now we can't see those treasures in heaven, we can't touch them, but that's the treasures we're aiming for, says Christ. "Where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." So whatever you're building up, whether it's treasures on earth, cash in the bank, or treasure in heaven, that's where your heart's going to be. That's where your desire's going to be, isn't it? Where you spend your time is going to tell you exactly where your desires are. "The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thine eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. If therefore that light that is in thee be darkness," bit of a paradox there, "how great is that darkness? No man can serve two masters." You can't serve one up here and one down here, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or else he'll hold to the one and despise the other. He cannot serve God and mammon. And mammon is basically materialism. So what does Jesus mean by having a single eye here? Well, this idea of the single eye from the Sermon on the Mount, I think really leads to the heart of this idea of living truly, living in truth, being true to what you believe. So notice the context there. We've got this idea of treasure, which might be natural, physical things, or treasure that is spiritual things up in heaven. What does your heart really want or desire? Well, where your eye looks is going to tell you exactly that, because your eye will always look towards what you really want in life. Now you might say, the kingdom of God, that's my one desire, but are you really living truly according to your words? So it sort of diagrammatically explained here. The eye here is a symbol of what we're taking into our brain, isn't it? Sort of the window of the soul, as it's sometimes called. It influences, it directs our thinking. What do we want to think about? Well, we're going to tell our eye to look at that, isn't it? And the eye here is, of course, focusing on lots of different treasures. Money, house perhaps, career, but there's also a little bit of light there as well. And the light represents spiritual knowledge. But what winds up in our brain? Well, Jesus says, if you're taking in darkness, your whole body or brain, your thoughts will be full of darkness. So the light basically gets crowded out, doesn't it? If we're trying to focus on lots of different things, lots of treasures on this earth, then the light is going to get crowded out. We can't try and serve God and mammon. Inevitably, it's God that will lose out. So trying to focus our sight on lots of different things, some heavenly, perhaps some earthly, It's going to get distracted, and what's going to wind up in our brain is just the earthly stuff. Instead, says Jesus, his idea of being the single eye is to be focused on one thing, and one thing only really, and that is the light which represents the knowledge of Christ. So 2 Corinthians 4 verse 6 says, "For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, hath shined in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." And later on, of course, Christ in the Sermon on the Mount says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you." Food and clothing and shelter, life's necessities. God knows you need them, but don't let that be your focus, says Christ. And the result of this, if we just focus on that, our whole body, our brain, if you like, is full of light. What's happening inside is exactly what we profess on the outside, to be people of faith. So what's the lesson for us from this idea of having our loins girt with truth? If truth is living truly, living according as we profess we believe, how do we do this? Well, I think Jesus' single eye idea is really the answer. Focus our eyes, our attention on the things that matter. Make them our desire. Make them the thing that we want to look at. Things above, as Paul says in Colossians 3 verse 1 to 2. Seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above. Have your attention, your eye looking at them, and make them your desire. Don't be distracted by money and social media and entertainment and sex and houses and careers. Don't be distracted by all those things, otherwise your brain, your body will be full of darkness. So again, it requires some discipline on our part. We need to think about what we're thinking about. Don't just let any old thing enter your mind, or get worse, pushed into your mind via social media. Don't be lazy thinkers. Be disciplined. Be disciplined about how much time you spend on things like social media, and reject those things that are contrary to your faith. Okay, we're going to do one last group activity. We're not probably going to get to our reading tonight, but we'll do one last group activity, which is this one. So in your groups, look up these quotes and just try and work out whether God, the Bible, Christ is saying we're to be living defined truth in this quote, or living truly to what we know and believe. So just have a look at these quotes and think about what type of truth the Bible is talking about here. So you've got even shorter, 3 minutes for this one. Division of labour, that's the key to getting it done. Okay, we might finish up that bit. So again, just yell them out. What do we reckon, Hosea 4 verse 1? Okay. Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. I thought it could be either because it definitely talks about knowledge of God afterwards, so it does seem to be defined truth. But previous to that, it's talking about mercy, which might be a characteristic that we need to live by as well. So, yep, happy with that. Luke 9 verse 27. Yeah, definitely define truth, isn't it? I tell you of a truth. It's not, that's pretty obvious. Isaiah 38 verse 3. Yeah, so walking in truth definitely sounds pretty much by living truthfully, doesn't it? According to my beliefs. John 16 verse 7. Yep. So Christ there says, I'm going to tell you the truth, and then he tells them a truth. So that definitely seems to be a defined truth. What about John 3 verse 21? Living. Yeah, I think so. So doing truth definitely seems to be a living the truth, living what you believe to be the truth, living according to our beliefs, doesn't it? What about Zechariah? Anyone get to Zechariah 8 verse 16? Because it's got... Yeah, good one. Yep, so yeah, both. So it's got a couple of references to truth there, and I think one's defined truth and the other is living the truth. Okay, so we're going to... dropped a tissue. So we're going to finish up pretty shortly. We're not going to get to John chapter 8, but there's the truth that will set you free there, and that truth is that we need to acknowledge that we're all sinners, which the Jews found incredibly hard. Well, they couldn't do it, to be honest. You can go through John chapter 8 and work through that. Jesus Christ calls himself the truth. So that's also interesting to look at that. And you could look at how Christ is the truth. But I want to finish by just talking about this idea of uniform and occupation. So at one glance at all of these people, you can tell exactly what they do for a job, can't you? And that's because their clothing or their uniform identifies their occupation clearly. And I think this is what Paul is sort of talking about when he talks about this idea of the spiritual warrior. But of course, we're not talking about a literal uniform, are we? We're talking about a spiritual uniform, not for a literal job, but for a spiritual job. So what does your uniform tell people about your occupation? Got some famous faces down here on this random photo I picked up, I think off the Suburban website, to be honest. Our uniform isn't made up of pieces of fabric, is it, or leather? It's made up of characteristics, attitudes. It's made up of fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. So this idea of truth and righteousness and peace. So again, we've got this idea of peace in this spiritual warrior. He's got spreading the gospel of peace, so that's a bit of a paradox, which no doubt whoever's going to talk about that will talk about. Faith, salvation, the Spirit word. So the last couple are gifts from God, but we need to develop those characteristics of the first four or so. Now, we can wear whatever uniform we choose, can't we? In Paul's language of Galatians 5, we can choose to wear the works of the flesh, or we can choose to wear the fruit of the Spirit. The works of the flesh is our natural uniform. We need to swap it out for this uniform, the uniform that's described in Galatians chapter 5 and in Ephesians chapter 6. So tonight we've looked at wearing truth, but Paul tells us to take on the whole armour, doesn't he? And what's our occupation in this uniform? Well, we're going to be spiritual warriors, not fighting against flesh and blood. We're not fighting other people, but we are fighting the philosophies of this world. And the battlefield that we're fighting on is our own hearts, our own minds, our own brains, our own thinking, our own desires. So the fight here is within. Don't love money, don't follow after money, have a single eye for God's righteousness. Find out what those defined truths in the Bible are and fight against our natural characteristics for the fruit of the Spirit characteristics.